Thank you very much. I'd like to thank first Leandro for the invitation, and I am absolutely conscious of the enormous work you're doing, gathering people together in this multi-disciplinary approach. So my topic will be about security. I will deal with some concepts such as security, hospitality, quality, community, with the idea of the changing meaning of home. In this speech, I won't have any slide. This may be the first time, but you are much more expert in photos, drawings, pictures, etc. than I am. So I'm going to deal with words, with concepts, and I hope I will meet your expectations. So my first point will be about housing as a value. My second point will be discussing the concept of security, and then I'll come to the concept of community, dealing with the question, what is good housing? In the introduction, I'd like to say, or to write the question, what can sociology bring to the debate about housing? And I'd like to start with the idea that statistics say a lot about housing, but maybe not enough. So starting with statistics, recently in most European societies, the issue of housing is at the heart of political and media debates, as it was after Second World War. And there is a renewed interest, which is probably not independent from the fact that the new social categories are affected, such as middle classes or even superior classes, who find difficulties to find a house. Housing inequalities are increasing and develop new features. I'm not going to quote all the authors I'm taking from ideas, but maybe we can discuss that later. The risk society, of course, Beck idea, makes life cycle more uncertain. And it seems that households are more and more dependent from decisions that are taken in areas which are not under their control. So what does statistics teach us? The last European Committee report on the social situations shows that European households dedicate in average 1/5 of their income for housing, which is much more than 10 years ago, and that the mortgage debt level has notably increased. It is also reported that many European households are living in non-adequate housing situations. According to Eurobarometer, for instance, last one, October 2013, 67% of the interviewed in 50 European cities estimate that it is not easy to find a good housing in the city where they live. 67. And I was amazed to see the large gap between, for instance, a city like Leipzig, 3% consider it's difficult to find a house, and Geneva, where 84% find difficult to find a house. In Barcelona, it's 31. So statistical data are good, they are much, but they are very difficult to interpret. The social and spatial distribution of households into the housing stock, the way they move home or they don't move home, the budget they dedicate to housing expenditure, etc., reveals huge gaps between regions, social groups, ages, types of family. Residential inequalities intersect the main lines of fractures that cross the French society and most of the European ones. Inequalities according to generations, families, social and geographical origin, generations, and even the color of the skin. One of the most direct features of residential inequality is the inequality of neighborhoods and of neighborhoods' amenities, what we call now spatial inequalities. Poverty perimeters, for instance, in France include 4.7 million inhabitants. Part of this perimeter needs to be demolished or deeply renewed. These statistics are not made anyway for analyzing the meaning of home or to understand properly to what extent the different social groups composing our societies are satisfied or frustrated with their housing conditions. So, what is good housing? What is a reasonable price? What are the criterions for satisfying housing standards? What are the ingredients that make a home valuable and desirable? Are these values the same for all? Can they be defined objectively? In a paper written in 1947, a sociologist that you may know, Louis Wirth, who wrote about the ghetto, the American sociologist, characterizes housing as a social activity. As he usefully argues, and I quote him, fruitful housing research might be devoted to the discovery of the housing ambitions of people and the manners in which and the degree to which these ambitions are frustrated among different economic and social groups in our society. Obviously, the housing crisis does not affect everyone in the same way and to the same extent. Everyday life is more or less marked by frustrated ambitions, to take on board this expression. Individuals and households are competing for a better place, but this better is matter of subjective appreciation. What then does sociology can offer in order to capture the meaning of home and housing as a social activity? For Louis Wirth, following, there are clearly three significant sociological aspects of housing. One, housing as a value. Is housing a complex of value? The answer is yes. Second, housing in relation to the community. Is housing depending from the community or the neighborhood? The answer is yes. Third, housing in relation with social policy. Is housing a matter of public concern? The answer is yes. I think this program is very relevant. So statistics say a lot about housing, but statistics fail in capturing the full meaning of home because home is much more than housing. How that happened, that home is more than housing? Not by case, those who contribute to this idea that home is something more than housing, those who contribute to this idea are those who are committed into housing, excluded sociologists, but those who are committed into housing issues and concerned with the social inclusiveness, adaptability, and sustainability of the built environment, etc., actually completely in line with your conference approach. As, for example, I'd like to quote Xavier Emmanueli. Maybe some of you know him. He was a state secretary in charge of humanitarian action in the end of the 19th, and he found the founder of the SAMU Social of Paris and then International SAMU Social. And this is how, I quote him, how he describes the house in a short video that he recorded years ago. He says, a house, it is not a single little box, it is an habitat, home. I translate it so, habitat, home, it is a home. There are neighbors, there are codes to be aware of, the codes of one's body, the code of space management, of neighbors management. This means alterity, otherness. This means there is a grammar, a symbolic, that it deals with time's grammar and of course also with budget issues. If I translate that in a more sociological expression, and then I quote another sociologist, Donald Foley, he says, there is increasing recognition that housing comprises much more than physical shelter, and that is especially encompasses the broader residential setting. Thus, housing comprises a complex bundle of consideration, including privacy, location, environmental amenities, symbolic characteristics, and investments. So, housing as a complex set of value framed into society. What does that imply? What does that imply? It implies that if a part of these values are universal, because everyone lives somewhere, housing refers to human condition, so it's universal. Another part is changing over time and space. The meaning of home has been sufficiently described and analyzed. It consists very broadly in fundamental actions. There are 4. First is organizing one space together with the cohabitants, allowing intimacy. The second is serving as a basis for social relations and allow hospitality, control openness and closeness. The third is being part of, also emotionally, belonging to the group, benefiting rights. And the fourth is favoring free allocation and time and autonomy. These are the fundamental anthropologists and sociologists agree more or less to draw. These 4 housing fundamentals are definitely threatened in our societies. It is important to understand how they are threatened, but it is important to understand how they are translated, how they are interpreted, how they are adapted by individuals, households, and social groups. So in a way, sociology helps to contextualize, to de-essentialize, to even demystify the meaning of home, which is always depending on the context. In order to go further, I suggest that the notion of insecurity versus security, including its different meanings as heuristic devices, allow a better understanding of the meaning of home. And now I take on board also Sigmund Baumann and Robert Castel. They both consider security, or the security issue, as crucial in our post-welfare or new welfare or risk societies, in a way which sounds to me very interesting. Insecurities are plural. They can be developed into 3 concepts, like insafety, uncertainty, and insecurity. And these 3 derivations, if you want, help to reveal the factors affecting the desirability of home, and consequently, they help to analyze to what extent the different social groups composing our societies are satisfied or frustrated with their housing conditions. So my first point is about housing as a complex set of values. What do people expect from home? What do they mean by being housed? What is the specific content of these values? I would like to start with empirical research I've conducted recently from files of applicants in social housing in several cities in France, which show that definitely home is something more than housing. What are the dimensions which are emerging from this outcome, from this research? They draw up basically 4 main dimensions of the meaning of home. The first is to have a family, to live with one's family, not to be separated, to have children, to be able to have children and raise them in a proper way. Second, to maintain one's in good health. Third, to work or study or get a training, to access a social position and keep it. Avoid social disqualification, have one's own life in hand. The 4th dimension is the relation one, to be connected with the others in a well-balanced way, to be able to receive guests, not to be a burden for others. So we find all these dimensions I was mentioning before. All these requirements are related to our analytical notions. The first one clearly refers to the sense of belonging and transmission, then the autonomy, etc. Other research I conducted, and of course other colleagues of mine, among more specific populations such as youth, young people, or aging, or women or migrants, etc. In my own research about young people and aging migrants, these basic requirements are modified according to the aspiration because of the specificity of the period of the life cycle. For most of the young people interviewed about their housing condition, housing basic requirements were always connected with the possibility to achieve studies or training in good conditions, and they were ready to sacrifice other aspects, including independence to a certain extent. For aging migrants, at the contrary, the more important was the benefit of a responding environment, nice people around, and a benevolent community. So the values are universal in a way and changing according to the context and the social group. And now I'd like to argue that the values are socially constructed, of course. And one of the best examples is probably the one of the so-called aspiration to home ownership. Let's take this example and ask, are we free of our choices? Individuals express their ambitions in an already framed context. Norms, on the one hand, market, in another hand. These are realities very difficult to change in a way. The existing supply of housing, for instance, is at the same time cause and consequence in the construction of individuals and housing and households' preferences. Finally, the level of welfare and social protection plays an important role. Home ownership, for instance, can be the expression of the privatization of social protection. It's not the duty of the state, it's your duty. This is a long-standing debate, very ideological, etc., but also very well documented, and I want to give an example from a young colleague of mine, recent thesis. She says, since 1980, the share of homeowners is systematically higher in England than in France. Why? Three factors seem to explain this observation. First, the policy of housing, which has strongly promoted access to homeownership in England since the Thatcher years. Then the system of mortgage credit in Britain. Finally, the model of welfare state. In societies where the property is highly prevalent, pensions, for instance, like protection, pensions, but also other types of welfare protection, can or could be much lower. In that case, it is the new welfare state policy, which consists in reducing public expenditure and expand private forms of insurance, which clearly promotes home ownership. In France, governments from right to left, with some differences, of course, but have all been keen on promoting home ownership because also it touches the sense of security and the sense of transmission. If you suppress heritage, you will suppress a large part of home ownership attractivity. This is why it is a value socially constructed. But it's more complex because, as already Wirth argued, Louis Wirth in the 40s, I quote him, "It should be also recognized that the desire for home ownership and the quest for security in life may be mutually incompatible." So, home ownership and security. To what extent it is a value which conflicts with economic security, home ownership, in general, and in particularly with the ability to take advantage of job opportunities, and they may arise in other parts of the city and in other cities. So, mobility versus home ownership. In low-income groups and in periods where housing demand is very great, as it is at present, that families may make a down payment on a home without actually being able to acquire full home ownership. In that case, their home ownership consists merely in the privilege of occupying the home as long as they can meet the mortgage and interest payment of the taxes. So I think it's a long-standing debate, but I wanted to mention it. When the property is effectively the banks, to what extent security is achieved and perceived. I reach my second point now about security as a multifold and changing notion. Zygmunt Bauman, that you may know, provides definition of insecurity from the German word Unsicherheit that encompasses three elements, as I mentioned before. Unsicherheit, insecurity, means insafety, uncertainty, and insecurity at the same time. Let's go more in detail into the meanings associated with these three levels. Unsafety concerns the safeguard of one's body, family, and property. It also concerns civil and juridical protection. For example, people feel unsafe thinking of becoming a probable victim of crime. Uncertainty concerns the control over the future and being able to make risk-free choices. It is then related to state-provided social protection against risk, like illness, unemployment, aging, etc. For example, people feel uncertain when thinking on how they could manage their life in case of precarious employment, etc. Insecurity, then, deals with the capability of facing up the risks of existence and the values and principles determining participation in society. For instance, people feel insecure if they could not find support from family, neighbors, whatever, institutions, when needed. Of course, these three levels are overlapping, but it can be very interesting to consider them separately. And I think very interesting as well to see that they can be turned into positive items. For instance, unsafety can be tackled and become safety if more safeguard, if more civil and juridical protection, if more personal and family and property protection, etc. Certainty also can be improved or provided, improving insurance, anticipation toward the future, awareness and predictability of risk, increasing capabilities to face risks, etc. Security also can be improved by guaranteeing social independence, guaranteeing capability to face the challenges of everyday life, by being able or enabling people to receive needed care when needed. So it becomes obvious that nowadays, security encompasses almost all dimensions of the housing issues, starting from the basic needs up to the intimate perception of one's own capacity to face risks, whatever they can be. So the question now is, who is going to provide this? And probably I would add that for the sake of democracy, security is a matter definitely of public responsibility. But by all means, security is also, of course, related to community. And as Wiewirth again says, I quote, "To know what is good housing involves also knowing what is good community." By community, as most sociologists, I mean a group created through a certain level of belonging, being spatial, and this is a neighborhood, being based on affinities, and this is the association, milieu, being political, and here come the nations and transnational bodies. This is community. These are communities. So my third point is, in a way, how safety, certainty, and security can be improved, allowing the achievement of good housing and feeling of home in the community. So security provided by the social belonging has two sources: institutional protections coming from the state or transnational bodies, the welfare, and local protection coming from the neighborhood, which is also likely to be the level of effectiveness of affinities and peer relations. But in our societies, there is a strong trend toward the requirement of self-insurance of one's security. So low-income groups, disaffiliated, as Robert Castel conceptualized, become more vulnerable if they cannot be supported by institutional protections. In France, for instance, we have 13,000 effective eviction in 2013, last year, which is the double number of a decade ago. So the security issue puts at stake, individually and collectively, the possibility of a good housing achievement. Now, if I try to model the link between housing conditions and security under the three dimensions I mentioned before, shall I be able to estimate or to compare the level of the different quality of home, actually? So let me take just 4 quick example, taking on board 4 quite common and somehow quite widespread figures of non-ordinary housing, which is more my field: the squat, the sheltering center, institutional sheltering centers, the barrack in an informal neighborhood, and the traveler's mobile home. As a test, if you want, to test that, to what extent are they uncertain, unsafe, and insecure. As the material conditions are poor in all those housing, safety will be a concern for all. But we can also assume that it depends mainly on the relation to the community and in the community. Solidarity among the members of the group, as it is well known for shanty towns, lots of sociological works, for informal settlements, and for squat as well. Solidarity among the members of the group may make the difference, making it or very safe or very unsafe, very certain or very uncertain, very secure or very insecure. More broadly, I guess the level of security depends on 1, the relations between neighbors and cohabitants. 2, depends on the type of regulation in the community. 3, depends on the agreement or lack of agreement with the landlords and local authorities. 4, depends on the type of the juridical status of occupancy. And last, depends on the stability of occupation. I think we have a lot to learn from these non-ordinary types of housing. But the main concern with non-ordinary housing may be the capacity to rule, to monitor, and to control access to the place. Practicing hospitality, being open, is always a way to regulate the relation in the community and with the community. In poorly protected spaces such as barracks and squats, openness is at the same time an unavoidable necessity to be open and a big danger. Conversely, if you think of these exclusive gated communities which close their access and permit an efficient filtering, these exclusive gated communities are a way to achieve security for their members. But the choice is maybe not the same in the two cases. So we know that people make arbitration in a very constrained context, much more in the squat situation than in the gated community, of course. But people make arbitrations in order to select the more important part of their aspirations and desires. Components of security can be irrelevant for certain groups or moments of life cycle. The strength of travelers is in the community more than in the place. Housing usually involves multiple locations. In our societies, we are so dependent from the sedentary norm that we hardly can figure out or even imagine what aspirations to mobile ways of living or just mobility are made of. In that case, uncertainty may not be a problem. Looking at certain moments of life, like youth, uncertainty can even be chosen. It can be a chosen way of living in order to, for instance, escape predictability, social pressure, or realize other goals, saving money, achieving studies or training, developed, shared, open living spaces, etc. All lifelong episodes of housing follow each other but are not alike. So the values are not alike. Under constraints, but also because of choices and opportunities, the universals of the meaning of the home can be seriously reconfigured, as I tried to explain. Now, the quality of home is something more than just comfort. Quality of housing not necessarily encompasses every dimension of security, as I hope I've been clear about that. But similarly, well-being, satisfaction with the living condition, feeling of home and comfort are not necessarily the same thing. Familiarity with the place, thanks to memory, thanks to landmarks, are also decisive. Also, in my view, too much underestimated. I'm going to quote another colleague. I like this quotation. Here I am on the set. He's describing a home which is not at all comfortable, but for lots of reasons makes him feel at home. So he says, here I am on the stairs. That of an old urban house of the Massif Central. This winter made it wet and icy. However, I feel myself comfortable. The stairs are docile under my foot. Each room that opens its door has a familiar smell. The decor and walls are my parents' work. It's Jacques Pezo-Massabio, 2002. So the quality of home is not necessarily in the elements of comfort as the norm define them. And the quality of home is also, of course, in the neighborhood. The quality of the neighborhood is crucial for all range of reasons: convenience of access to place of work, facilities and public services, adequacy to one's everyday life routine, and two symbolic expectations, the reputation of the neighborhood, are deeply affecting the desirability or undesirability of a house. As we know, the control of the space in the neighborhoods in our cities is a matter of more or less visible struggles and confrontations. Social inclusiveness is challenged there, and this is why it is so important to consider housing under the public responsibility that it involves. In a word, under its political dimension. I take the example of urban amenities, and I guess I argue that they are political and social at the same time because they require public money to be invested and because they need human beings to making them functioning. I'd like to give a last example from an ongoing research on urban amenities as enabling device. I argue that certain amenities participate as resources and contribute to create more welcoming and hospitable cities for the poor. Free of charge public baths in Paris, for instance, are one of those amenities. They offer a service that is usually available inside the domestic space by norm. 95% of the housing units get a bathroom and hot water. But it is not just hot water and a protected space for intimate hygiene which is delivered. It is also care and hospitality. Conversely, not only those who are homeless use such baths, such places. From a conversation, for example, with an old woman last December, she said, "I come here because I'm old and I'm afraid to fall into my bathtub." Some people, they come here because of the invoices. Everything is there. I mean, also the cost of electricity, water, delivering as a public concern. They come here also because of the invoices, but she comes there because she feels old and vulnerable. I come to my conclusion. Housing has a chance. I will conclude briefly underlining the importance of a series of remarks, which I hope make sense in this international and multidisciplinary context. As housing is definitely a political issue, a matter of public responsibility and democracy, it is crucial to figure out under what condition a common vision of good housing, that is also to say good life, could emerge. As housing is definitely a social activity, it is crucial to develop the knowledge of housing aspirations and desires in the different groups composing societies. The knowledge regarding housing is good, is large. We know a lot about housing in the past, the history of social housing, for instance, and the conflicting ideas about the welfare, what should it do or not. We have a great deal of surveys and good research about housing conditions. We have statistics, we have reports about how housing contributes to reproduce inequalities. And last but not least, we have good competences in architecture, planning. Of course, you have ideas and projects. What is less evident is the knowledge regarding the meaning of home. Do we have enough understanding about the wishes and expectations of individuals and groups? And do we know to what extent those expectations are competing? In my view, and these are my last words, the production of knowledge is quite divided. In my view, and roughly, a part of this knowledge is operational and aimed to manage the housing sector in a more or less managerial and commercial approach. In a second part, a second part, if you want, of this knowledge is more dedicated to improve scientific knowledge and again, a better understanding of frustrated ambitions is of high relevance in that field. But there is still a part, maybe the biggest, which is still invisible and undiscovered. We are all inhabitants, and as such, we are all concerned by the question. But our dreams are poor and trapped into norms and into manufactured serial supply. We have a legacy of utopia, which has become reality, with the first episode of social housing, for instance. We have the legacy of pioneers' experience in the realm of auto-construction and self-managed cooperative. Today, we have excellent small-scale projects and subtle, unconventional behaviors and ideas that can pave the way. But participatory processes are operating on the margins, not at the core, and they are poorly supported. If we want to better capture the changing meaning of home and invent a better future, we should also indeed disinhibit our desires and give free rein to imagination in order to strengthen collective intelligence. Thank you for your attention.
So we'll try the microphone if you want to make any question.
Are you going to leave me alone here?
No, maybe you can just take time and go there, because we are here watching the technology problems. Let's try to do it here, maybe.
It seems to work.
Yes. So let's share the microphone. So I think that the way you presented the question of the opposition between housing and home, I think in a way what I was wondering when you were just trying to position the both areas is where do we put the demarcation line between both? Because sometimes in the field of architecture we refer to housing as everything that has to do with the object, with the construction, with the management, and to home as the memories, the experience, the experiential side of being housed. That's at least how we put the two concepts sometimes in architecture. And the difficulty we have is how to bring them together, because it's very easy for architects, I'm talking now from the architect's point of view, it's very easy just to go only on the area that you control, where your expertise is, that is in designing, building, providing the object, composition, economy, structure, and so on. And then it comes the people living in, the people who really give values, the values that you were mentioning, the values to the place, and the sense of place, the sense of belonging, the values that we're hearing now from the point of view of anthropology, sociology is come into play. So we always have like a feeling that we are witnessing a dilemma between both things that we are not able to solve from the point of view of architecture, because how we're going to understand those values in order to bring them into our field and give a professional answer to that, how to transform those values into form and space in a way. And the other way around also is the same problem, because the examples you put about the squats, the barracks, and the mobile homes, these are very representative examples of things that from the architectural quality you would say, I'm not an architect of barracks, right? I'm an architect of well-designed buildings, of structured neighborhoods. But it happens that badly designed buildings, from the point of view of what is bad or good housing, it becomes a real good home in a sense of belonging, a sense of community building. So this is how we see it from our perspective. I don't know if some of our colleagues here have or wants to put another kind of relationship between these two concepts, because I think it's an important issue here. Maybe the microphone is here. If you would like to say something about it, maybe you can.
To your presentation, I was just wondering if the financial crisis, as a sociologist, I presume you probably have looked at how the financial crisis of 2008 has affected people's interpretation or people's interaction or feelings towards housing. How do they feel about home today compared to how they felt about home? If there's any change as a result of the financial crisis of 2008?
Shall I answer? Or try to answer? Thank you for inviting me to discuss with you. I'd like to first maybe to make a remark on your question. I think it's not a matter of opposing the two concepts, home and housing. My idea is more to reintegrate home into housing. That in sociological words, it would be to objectivize these values. That means we should not oppose housing and home as two different things because they are linked. But the aspect of the meaning of home, which is about values, about people preferences, about frustration, about conflicts, class conflicts, neighborhood conflicts, etc., should be reintegrated and should be objectivized. We think we could this is why I started with a statistic. We can objectify how many square meters, how many, I don't know, the water, electricity, norms, standards, etc. But we can also objectify the value. And I think it's very worth to do it, to understand to what extent people prefer or dislike. We know things about that. We know that noise is a main concern. In French housing survey, national survey, noise appears as to be the more damageable thing. But I think housing is not objective and home subjective. Home is, of course, matter of subjectivity, but it's also objectivable, and we can have real valuable data and experience and research about that. This was my first one. A bit like, you know, Henri Lefebvre was opposing the product and the œuvre, the opera. The product is manufactured and doesn't require imagination. It's standardized. Housing would be that product. And home would be something much more an œuvre, like an artist piece of work. And what I argue is that we have to reintegrate l'œuvre into the product. This is all. But I think it's possible, and sociology is made for that. About your question on the impact of financial crisis, I think it's a very valuable question because, of course, as I try to explain, this complex set of value is not made once for all. It's object to change under phenomena such as financial crisis and changing in the policy, etc. So yes, definitely I think the housing crisis brought something new into the way people think about housing, but again, depending on one's social position. Somebody who has money to invest in real estate will not react at the financial crisis as somebody who is in danger to lose his house, you see? But the one who is in danger to lose his house, he will check, is there a political responsiveness here that can help me? And then it will be transformed into something different, a frustration and maybe a social movement, I don't know. I think the same question about financial crisis can be made about the changes in welfare state. And I think the less investment, public investment in social housing, for instance, is an issue that have lots of impacts on the way households are reacting. In France, for instance, a large part of poor or low-income household try to become homeowner. They get into incredible debts. And this is a problem. This is a problem, of course, for them, but this is also a thing to be thought collectively, because that means that the desire to become owner is stronger than the identification of the risk. And what does that mean for a sociologist? That means that this desire is definitely stronger. And when will it bring? But it is also framed by the policy, which are putting pressure, not only the policy, but also all the stakeholders interacting in the field. So it's definitely, yes, impacts of financial crisis, changes in the welfare, etc., are impacting housing desires and preferences.
Thank you for your presentation, and I would like to ask you, as expert in housing sociology, you mentioned during your presentation this phenomena as housing satisfaction. And it's quite common that we are using these data about housing satisfaction to evaluate housing quality. For architects, it's quite common. But when we are going to look to these data more deeper, we could see actually very high satisfaction with housing in very, very different actually housing standards. An example, some years ago, I participated in this European Network for Housing Research in conference, and there was a report from UK where colleagues reported about renovation project in one huge area in UK, and before renovation, this housing satisfaction was something 75%, and after renovation, where a lot of millions were spent for this renovation, this housing satisfaction growing till 76% or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it means that it's a lot relates with social topics, not with physical
The
architectural
walls.
ones. Yeah. Yes. Maybe some comment how we could use actually these data about housing satisfaction in our work.
I don't know how long we have. It's a very large question, but in brief, I would start from what kind of survey has been made, because the satisfaction surveys are most of the time extremely bad. I mean, I'm exaggerating because it's short time, but this is part of my conclusion. Lots of data are made by those who are interested in the result. And as they are interested in the result, it's difficult that they can objectivize the questions. For instance, are you satisfied of your housing condition? One morning I say yes, and the evening I say no because I'm tired. I don't know. It's all about the quality of the survey. And the surveys about satisfaction are extremely difficult. They require a methodology. This is my first point. Second, how that happened at 65 and then after renovation 66. Maybe the 65 was wrong. Maybe the 66 is wrong as well. And probably the questions were not good. But it doesn't mean, if I just see that, I wouldn't say the renovation has failed, because it depends completely on who has been interviewed, what question has been made, etc. Probably there is something wrong, but we don't know what exactly.